So at Cisco Duo, we regularly hear from our customers that our products deliver tremendous value in securing access to the critical resources because they provide strong security and at the same time a great user and admin experience. However, we believe it's important to quantify those benefits to help business leaders make objective decisions regarding the use of our products. Therefore, we enlisted our friends at Forrester to do a total economic impact study on the value Cisco Duo provides by securing workforce access. I'm Matt Brooks, a product marketing manager at Cisco Duo. Today I'm pleased to be joined by Marianne North, a TEI consultant for Forrester, and Merritt Maxim, a vice president of security research at Forrester, to present their findings. For today's session, Marianne will start by explaining the Forrester TEI methodology and the Duo TEI findings. And I'll take a few minutes to discuss how Cisco Duo provides zero trust security. Next, Marianne will talk about how interviewees felt Duo reduced their risk of credentials-related security breaches and walk through that benefit calculation from the TEI study. Then Merritt will elaborate on evidence of credentials-based security breaches and how much this can cost an org. We'll also talk about the need to adopt zero trust security principles to prevent these kinds of threats, especially around verifying user and device identity. And I'll get into some specifics on how Duo can reduce IT and administrative costs. Marianne will walk through study findings on the end user time saving from streamlined authentication backed by the TEI study, while Merritt will discuss a use case where an IT desk was swamped with requests and how Duo's ease of use addressed the need for security measures that frustrate the attacker and not the user. And now Marianne will discuss the TEI methodology and Duo TEI findings.
Hello, everyone. Again, Marianne North from Forrester. Thank you all for joining us. Great. So today I'm going to briefly explain Forrester's total economic impact, or TEI methodology, and also the results of the Cisco Duo TEI study. I'm going to be moving pretty fast, so I encourage you to read the case study later. Next slide. So, what is a TEI case study? Next slide. We can all agree that a business case is important when making decisions on tech investments. The business cases vary greatly in quality. Forrester's TEI methodology is very comprehensive. Few of the other methodologies you might encounter look at risk. None of them look at flexibility. TEI is Forrester's proprietary framework that we use to build the business case for IT investments. It's an objective, third-party way to capture and quantify the voice of our clients' customers, so in this case, Cisco Duo customers. It helps organizations, like your own perhaps, to demonstrate and justify the value of their IT initiatives to their senior management and other stakeholders. Been around for more than 20 years, it's used by hundreds of tech providers, including the largest in the world. Next slide. Here are the four major components of that TEI methodology. Benefits, costs, pretty straightforward stuff. Flexibility, that refers to the opportunities or the options that a tech investment today may produce for an organization in the future. So those options represent value over and above the immediate benefits of a technology. That risk component of the TEI methodology is where we mathematically remove the rose-colored glasses. We decrease benefits and increase costs to make our financial analysis conservative and defensible. Next slide, please. Here's how Forrester creates a TEI study. First, due diligence. Secondary research about Duo and how customers use it. Then, the customer interviews. That's primary research, where in this case, we asked 4 Cisco Duo customers a lot of questions about how their organizations operated before Duo, why they chose it, and their experience with it. After the interviews, we created a description of a composite organization. Might be a new concept to you, but that composite is essentially a vehicle for telling the story that we heard from customers. So you can think of that composite as an analytical smoothie. Not quite like any of the ingredients, meaning the companies we interviewed, but it reflects characteristics of all of them. It's how we aggregate our understanding of Duo's value, and we then use that composite as a framework to build a financial model. So the financial results that we calculate, and that you'll see detailed in the study, and I'll mention briefly today, are all described from the point of view of this composite organization versus any one of the four companies. Then all that input goes into the case study. Next slide, please. Before I share some key metrics, a few quick disclosures. The study was commissioned by Cisco. Cisco provided the customers, but Forrester retains editorial control of these TEI studies. And a TEI study doesn't imply Forrester's endorsement of Duo or of Cisco. And know that your own mileage may vary. So we recommend you use the framework that we'll describe in the study to determine your own organization's potential impact from using Duo. Next slide, please. Here's a quick summary of Duo's impact on the composite. It got a 159% return on its Duo investment. Its benefits from using Duo totaled more than $5 million over 3 years. And in less than 6 months, it had paid back its investment. Next slide, please. So I'll share with you more details on those results. But first, I want to provide some quick background on who we interviewed. Next slide, please. The interviewed organizations were in multiple industries, and they had anywhere from 1,200 to 12,000 Duo protected accounts. And before investing in Duo, those organizations either addressed credentials-related security, including authentication, with some other vendor's solution, or they protected access to their applications using only static passwords. Next slide, please. And with those previous approaches, the organizations felt they didn't sufficiently protect their organizations against data losses from a credentials-related security breach. They felt they didn't produce enough intelligence around access attempts, and they felt their prior situation had created additional costs in the form of productivity drags on end users, on help desk staff, on their security analysts, on other IT staff. A lot of time lost. Next slide, please. This quote from a cybersecurity analyst we interviewed highlights some of those challenges. Basically, that the organizations lacked visibility and intelligence around their access attempts. I didn't feel good about that. Next slide, please. So here's a quick summary of that composite organization. It's a $3 billion global company, has 10,000 Duo protected accounts. It has both cloud and on-prem applications. Those are accessed in various ways and often remotely. Next slide, please. So let's dive deeper on those study results. Next slide, please. Here's a summary of the Duo benefits we heard about. A reduced risk of a credentials-related security breach valued at nearly $800,000, and other benefits, most of which reflect how Duo makes things easier for end users, for security analysts, for IT staff. I'm going to cover 4 of those 6 benefits now. Then I'll come back a bit later to risk reduction after Cisco talks a bit about Duo features that reduce risk. And later I'll talk more about how end users save time with Duo's streamlined authentication. Next slide. Improved security analyst productivity. So the analysts at this composite organization now spend less time troubleshooting and investigating potential security issues that arise from suspicious login attempts. And that's because of Duo's easy navigation, its integration with other applications, and the detailed information it provides about each authentication attempt. The average time to investigate an alert when using Duo dropped from an hour and a half to 10 minutes. Next slide, please. So by moving to Duo, the composite avoids the ongoing maintenance and support fees that it used to pay on that previous solution. And it also no longer has to replace end users' authentication devices every few years. Another direct expense and more time. Next slide, please. And since Duo is simpler to manage and support compared to the composite's prior solution, its IT staff need less time to administer it, to deploy more of its functionality, to add new use cases, and simply to just optimize its use for their organizations. And because Duo is easier to use, the composite also eliminates some expenses that it previously had, paying for professional services that it needed to fill the internal expertise gaps of using a more complicated authentication product. Next slide, please. Because Duo simplifies end users' authentication process and it eliminates their need for a separate authentication device, fewer authentication-related cases reach the help desk. And that saves time for end users. It saves time for the help desk staff. Next slide. The study also describes the number of unquantified benefits, things that Duo customers couldn't quite put numbers around, but they valued nonetheless, such as a better end user experience, which saved time and reduced frustration. The ease of further improving that user experience with Duo's single sign-on, so that Duo users can have a simplified, consistent login for all applications that were integrated with Duo. Audit and regulatory compliance efficiencies by automating some audit activities, and enhanced ability to acquire new customers or partners because they're using Duo provided a comfort level. Some vendor rationalization for organizations that used other Cisco products. And lastly, Duo's moderate learning curve and the value of Duo Care premium support. So all things that they couldn't quite give us numbers for, but thought were important nonetheless. Next slide, please. Yes, of course, there's a price tag on all those great benefits. And in this case, the composite pays subscription fees for Duo. And it also opts to pay for Duo Care, which is an enhanced level of support that the interviewees found very helpful. In addition, of course, the composite's got to pay its employees to implement, manage, and support Duo. Next slide. I mentioned the TEI studies include flexibility and risk factors. You'll see more about that when you read the study, but here are some examples. So flexibility. It's unique to each customer, how they use it, but it might include further capitalizing on Duo's capabilities over time, or maybe protecting some additional applications with Duo. The risks that get addressed in TEI studies are around what you see there in the middle and right columns. So they're either impact risk, for which we decrease the benefits, or implementation risk, for which we increase the costs. Next slide, please. So a quick wrap up. By investing in Duo, Composite realized 159% ROI. Their net present value, so those benefits I mentioned with costs removed, of still more than $3 million and payback in less than 6 months. I'll cover those other two benefits a little later, but right now, back to you, Matt, and next slide.
Thanks, Marianne. Now we'll talk about how Duo offers reduced risk of breach with our security features, including single sign-on, passwordless authentication, and risk-based authentication, and how Duo can help organizations implement a zero-trust security model with these capabilities. Today's enterprise environments are moving to the zero-trust security model. It means different things to different people, but most agree it encompasses these basic principles: never assume trust, always verify trust, and enforce least privilege. When you compare traditional security approaches to a zero-trust approach, You find that in the old security model, trust is based solely on the network location that the access request originates from. In a zero trust approach, trust is more dynamic and adaptive. It's established for every access request, no matter where it comes from. This approach prevents attackers from moving laterally within your network to get your data. It secures access across your apps and networks by only allowing trusted users and devices, and it supports modern enterprise use cases like BYOD, the use of cloud native applications, and hybrid cloud environments. However, you cannot have good security that companies get from moving to zero trust without good user experience. Historically, stringent security solutions drag down business execution, with users bogged down by access requirements. On the flip side, more lenient policies created risk exposures if users are left without constraints. Security and usability have traditionally been at odds with each other, but Duo doesn't see it that way. It's purposely designed with security and ease of use in mind. Duo allows users to log in and work using their own devices. It only requires user interaction if necessary and facilitates fast access to corporate applications and resources. Cisco Duo provides a rare combination, increasing security and increasing productivity at the same time. Cybersecurity is the biggest geopolitical issue of our time, and since its inception, it's been Duo's mission to democratize security. That means thinking differently about people we serve, whether it's people who use our solutions, people who roll it out, or people who maintain it. The objective has always been to make security easy and accessible, irrespective of people's technological aptitude or the size of their company's budget. We want to provide strong security that doesn't get in the way of productivity, coupled with our strong ethos, which provides an unmatched value in the ever changing security arena. Achieving strong security in the area of sophisticated attacks requires a combination of multi layered defenses. First layer is about defeating attacks that target multi factor authentication. Success in this area requires implementing phishing resistant authentication. Duo supports MFA factors such as FIDO2 WebAuthn, along with passwordless authentication to all paying customers. The second layer automatically adapts authentication requirements when risk rises. When a high-risk login attempt is detected, Duo increases security by requiring a more secure factor such as a FIDO2 authenticator or verified Duo push with number matching. Increasing friction only when needed allows users to stay productive and secure. The third layer is about leaving no gaps in protection. Duo covers your entire workforce and their devices, regardless of who owns or manages them. The fourth layer is about preventing attackers from using their own devices to gain access. Duo's trusted endpoints policy allows you to block or allow devices based on whether they are managed by your organization or registered with Duo. Duo provides streamlined access to all applications with single sign-on. This reduces reliance on passwords and lowers IT costs. Enforces application-specific access policies by enlisting adaptive and risk-based authentication, and delivers consistent access to all applications from one location. Duo Passwordless eliminates the need for the convoluted password process with a simple process that provides strong authentication. Duo supports platform biometric authenticators such as Touch ID or Windows Hello, FIDO2 security keys such as YubiKey, and Duo Mobile with passwordless push for environments where users' access devices may not support biometrics. Passwordless authentication using FIDO2 with platform and security key authenticators follow the same simple process, eliminating the something you know factor from passwords and replacing it with the something you have factor in the form of the user access device and the something you are factor in the form of a facial scan or fingerprint. Passwordless authentication using Duo Mobile extends those factors to user smartphones to take advantage of their built-in biometric capabilities. Duo's risk-based authentication determines risk in real time at login by evaluating the context around the user and their device, such as location, time zone, device proximity, and more. And requests additional verifications if needed, all the while preserving user privacy. For sensitive apps or highly privileged users, Verified Duo Push can be turned on for every authentication attempt, or risk-based authentication can invoke it when risk signals dictate. Wi-Fi fingerprint creates a hash of anonymized Wi-Fi network data to identify when a user may have changed locations, meriting a stronger authentication. This is based on patent pending technology, and it's just one of the many novel signals Duo risk-based authentication relies on. And now Marianne will discuss the security benefit findings.
Thanks, Matt. So here's one of the benefits I didn't cover earlier, but it's a big one for all the kinds of reasons that Matt just was discussing. So interviewees told us that by deploying Duo, their organizations reduced the risk of a credentials-related security breach. And they attributed that risk reduction to Duo capabilities that went far beyond the authentication method itself, such as the intelligence that Duo provided for each authentication attempt, Duo's extensive capabilities around authentication-related security and security policies, and also simply just the ease with which they could consistently, comprehensively apply those security policies across their organizations and change or update them as they needed to. So a couple of examples of things we heard about. Duo enabled the interviewees' organizations to better identify their systems, so user devices, et cetera, that were vulnerable to credential threat attacks. And Duo did that through context analysis and through continuous inspection of the security posture of each device at every access attempt. So Duo also enabled organizations to implement more granular authentication policies than they'd previously been able to do. And that might be things like setting up additional detail around who can access what, and detail around how they can access. So for instance, maybe restricting access from certain locations, or even just limiting access from non-compliant devices, telling end users, get compliant or you can't access. So they simply had a lot of capabilities they hadn't had before and felt that that made a significant difference in their risk to a credential-related security breach. Now, over to my Forrester colleague, Barrett Maxim, for some broader industry stuff around all of this.
Thanks, Marianne. So obviously we've been talking a lot from Matt and Marianne on kind of where we're at with authentication, but part of the reason why we're still have this issue is because passwords continue to persist in the environment, or organizations continue to struggle with them, and hackers continue to target them. And when we actually look at, and this is from our own Forrester survey, not from the TEI study specifically, we look at kind of people and their average password length, the more complex passwords, which are generally believed to be more harder to break, you see that's still not in use by the majority of people are still using 8 to 10 characters, which can be very easily compromised, unfortunately. And if you look at the next slide, probably the even bigger problem is that people reuse passwords across multiple online accounts, which means that a password combination that's compromised at one site can now be used at another site. And this creates a bunch of additional risk for organizations that they have to kind of better manage. Now, the good news is you do see device vendors like Apple and Google are starting to do alerts where they'll identify you if you're using, say, a password store in their browser, that if that combination has been found on the dark web or somewhere else, to try and prompt you to change it. But the reality is that reuse of passwords is the gift that keeps on giving, because once hackers have a combination, they know that users are more likely to reuse that combination somewhere else, and they can therefore hack site A and then try to use that same combination at a secondary site. Next slide. In addition, it's important to kind of understand that there are a range of tactics that are available to hackers today to actually exploit passwords. Usually when you think of a password attack, you may think of a single kind of brute force attack. And if you haven't heard of the concept of rainbow tables, I encourage you to look those up online. Basically, those are essentially reverse engineered plain text passwords based off of their cryptographic hash using standard algorithms. So you can essentially, you don't even need, quote unquote old days, you used to actually have hardware and horsepower to actually go out and brute force attack passwords. Now, if you know what the hashing algorithm that was used, you can really just go to rainbow tables and look up the hashes for very common passwords, and then just do a search and find in your stolen data to find those combinations. But there are other ones. Password spray. This is one where we know that people use password 123 or password as a common password, and they'll just try to take a combination of, say, usernames or email addresses with that password and do a spray across multiple sites in the hopes of actually getting success there. And again, that this is a very easy tactic for hackers to proceed. Credential stuffing. This is a scenario where I've obtained data from a data breach, and now I'm just going to try those credentials in a bunch of other sites. And again, give you a sense here of what the protection level against these is relatively low, which means the ability for hackers to persist and successfully obtain passwords remains very high, which is why you see, as kind of Matt alluded to, the kind of rise of what we kind of call phishing resistant MFA, where that additional number may be displayed in the authenticator app to help eliminate the scenarios where user just gets an automatic notification to approve our authentication request and they just accept it kind of blindly. There's been several attacks that have successfully been propagated by hackers relying on sending lots of notifications to a user on the assumption that eventually the user is going to just say approve, and once they do that, the hackers actually are able to bypass authentication. So while we know passwords are bad, it's important to understand that there are a range of tactics, and hackers will continue to exploit these for the foreseeable future. So this is all the more reason for you to be looking at alternatives of passwords like multi-factor authentication to help minimize the risk from these types of attacks. Next slide. It goes without saying, right? We know that breaches are expensive, and again, when we look at our own data here, for organizations who were breached, their average costs or cumulative costs of breaches, is in the, to pick a number, it's in the millions of dollars, and this really is only calculating direct costs, in other words, direct, say, IT support costs or other things, or maybe compliance fines associated with costs. This really doesn't measure the indirect impacts, like, say, brand approval or brand perception, customer retention. These are other kind of longer term effects that are significant. They're harder to model, but the point being, kind of as you saw in our in the TEI model, that the risks, the costs of breaches are quite high. So any tool that can be deployed that helps reduce the risk of those breaches is going to generate a very compelling ROI. And certainly with authentication, that's definitely the case, because we see that the data breach costs are so high, and you're not going to be able to eliminate completely the potential for a data breach, but you certainly are going to be able to reduce the probability or make it much harder for hackers to persist. And I would say, hackers are social creatures like anyone else, and they are at times, if they see a site as protected with multi-factor authentication, they're likely to move on somewhere else that doesn't, rather than trying to invest the effort of trying to bypass authentication. So that's another way that strong authentication can help reduce hacking attempts against the environment, because the hackers decide that they want to go somewhere that's easier to actually bypass. Next slide. So when we actually look at it with our own data, like how are these attacks carried out? There's a range of different approaches. Some could be vulnerability exploits in the software itself, but you see, like phishing and social engineering are right at the top of the list. And again, this continues to be a very common problem. Users like to click on links, and I would say that hackers themselves are making better formed emails now that make it harder to detect. You used to be able to kind of see almost a giveaway, there was a misspelling or the logo was wrong or something, but I know even myself that I've caught myself paying much more attention to some emails I've received in the last few months, because they are, at the surface, they do look legitimate, and then you realize that in fact is not, it is a phishing email, but phishing continues to be a problem, because once the user click on that, it allows malware to load. It could be a keystroke logger or something like that, which allow them to capture passwords. But we also see, that use of weaker stolen credentials continues to be right up there as list as well. So again, these are all the types of problems that using passwords causes, and why authentication, stronger forms of authentication, deliver a lot of value. Next slide. And then when we look at like what are the effects, this is kind of to my point about the kind of costs of a breach, and we see that there's a range of different approaches, some of which are easier to quantify, like theft of data, others of which may be harder to quantify, whether it's say difficulty attracting new customers, or how the business partners, or you lost customers. But again, the point is that there's a range of breach effects that companies have to contend with, and these all have some material costs associated with them. And so again, this is why you need to continue to be diligent in doing your best to try to defend against these kinds of attacks, because the consequences of innovation are increasingly more distributed, more complex, because systems are more interconnected, and therefore you really do need to be doing all you can to try to minimize the risk of these types of attacks. Next slide. So I know Matt already kind of introduced the zero trust principles. This is kind of just a reminder of kind of the underlying principle here. And again, Cisco Duo is well aligned with the zero trust model. The underlying principles here being all networks are untrusted. You rely on the principle of least privileged access, and you assume that your systems haven't been compromised, and you inspect and monitor everything. And so that's the identity becomes a core part of that. And so for a lot of companies, authentication is often kind of where they may start their zero trust journey, because it's very clear that obviously I don't trust anyone, and I'm therefore going to require some higher level of assurance, like a multi-factor authentication prompt, before I allow that user to access anything in my environment, whether they are an employee, customer, or partner. Next slide. Again, zero trust has been around for since the early 2010 era. And originally it was very network centric, but again, as Forrester is kind of one of the creators of the zero trust model, it really now involves an entire ecosystem that relates to workloads, identities, devices, people, with kind of data at the center here. And again, this kind of same principle applies, but you've probably seen zero trust is getting a lot more kind of coverage and perspective, both say by the media and by vendors, and it is I think a very useful construct for companies to think about how they want to architect and build their systems to better defend against hackers going forward. Next slide. And again, I kind of already alluded to, we talk about the zero trust extended ecosystem, or ZTX, where you've got these actual 7 components here. Automation orchestration should be the 7th, not 8, but it gives you a sense of all the kind of components that you can think about within the ZTX ecosystem. Data is at the center, right? Because that's actually what everyone is after. Both your employees are after it to actually do their jobs, but hackers and others are after it because that's the value, that's the asset that they're after. And so you look at how you therefore apply zero trust principles to your people, to your devices, to your network, and your workloads to help minimize the risk of that data itself being compromised externally. Next slide. Again, principles of zero trust, Matt already had a slide on this. And again, multi-factor aligns very well here. The kind of concept of verifying explicitly. This is where multi-factor authentication plays a very strong role. Privileged identity management also plays a role there. And then on the kind of concept of assuming breach, that's also where multi-factor authentication is a key tool that is part of building your zero trust story. Next slide. I think a last kind of point to make is, again, remember, zero trust is not a product. It is a architecture or a mindset. And so it's important for companies that you're already likely doing some zero trust tasks based on products you may have already deployed and are running in your environment today. So I think this is important, particularly for people outside of IT who may have heard about zero trust and kind of understand what it means. This doesn't mean that you have to re-architect or redeploy everything that you do to secure environment. It's just important to get a sense that there are some products like traditional endpoint security that it's been around for a long time. That's a form of zero trust capabilities. And so you may already be using some zero trust kind of principles in your environment and not even be aware of it. And this is just kind of a list of what some of those technologies are across the kind of 5 main areas of the ecosystem. Next slide. I think, yeah, now it's
Yep.
back to
Yeah, I think I'll take it.
back to Matt.
Thanks,
You're
Marianne.
talking a bit
Thank
more
you.
about the cost reduction.
Right. So yeah, we'll talk about how Cisco Duo can actually, go ahead and lower IT and administrative costs. So Duo enables high productivity in several ways. First, by ensuring that access to resources and applications is always easy, such as with Duo Central providing single sign-on for users through a consolidated launch point for all applications. Also, by only requiring or increasing authentication when needed, as we discussed with the use of risk-based authentication. And by reducing IT and end user burden by empowering users to initiate software updates themselves, along with clear guidance, and by accelerating identity related incident detection and investigation, servicing highly anomalous access and device registration attempts to highlight potentially suspicious activity. Dual self-enrollment allows users the ability to easily enroll themselves in minutes. This reduces their time to productivity by streamlining an onboarding process that can be cumbersome with other vendors. Using their own devices on a large scale with little to no help desk support, all the while reducing total cost of ownership by freeing up the IT operations team. Duo also allows users to select a preferred MFA authenticator from an admin configured list or their own devices with just a few steps, just in time when they're logging into applications. Users can also manage all their devices in one place, specify default devices or reset devices. Duo provides differentiated functionality to improve security posture and unburden IT by notifying end users and educating them how to remediate their own devices, which contrasts other solutions that simply direct users to reach out to their IT administrator for help. Here we see guidance for out-of-date browsers, or in this case, the operating system is out of date. However, once the user updates it based on guidance Duo provides, they're immediately allowed to authenticate and then access their target application. For administrators, Duo excels at policy design, creation, and implementation. Policies are centrally managed in the Duo admin panel, where admins can map compliance and security requirements to Duo policies. Policies are flexible and they can be applied globally for all users and applications, at the application level for specific applications, or group level only for specific sets of users. Detailed authentication logs help keep SOCs and security practitioners on top of their environments, with clear messaging explaining why authentications are or are not trusted, rather than giving ambiguous risk scores. After setting up Duo for MFA, our solution analyzes the authentication data for protected applications. Duo Trust Monitor can use this data to create historical and contextual baselines of access activity in the environment. It then services risky and atypical logins by comparing subsequent login attempts to the baseline to find anomalies. Some risky activity may point to an attacker using compromised credentials. In these cases, Duo provides valuable insights to help you remediate compromised access quickly. Duo is a smart and secure access management solution that pays for itself and provides unmatched value because it reduces IT costs and overhead. It allows customers to reach compliance requirements and decrease cyber liability insurance rates. And it enables customers to seamlessly start their zero trust journey. Duo works with what our customers have without requiring them to change infrastructure dramatically. Duo's functionality is offered in three clear-cut editions. Duo Essentials is a full-featured access management solution that includes strong MFA, passwordless, single sign-on, and trusted endpoints verification for every organization. Duo Advantage adds to Essentials features, maximizing security and visibility to address constant changes in risk levels, and the need for rapid security incident detection, enabling customers with full device trust, providing visibility into device health status, along with machine learning driven attack detection. Duo Premier is a complete access management solution that addresses user and device risk for every application, with protection and ease of access to cloud, on-premise resources, and private applications. And now Marianne will discuss the cost of complex authentication.
Thanks, Matt. So here's that final benefit I mentioned briefly earlier. We saw a list of customer challenges earlier, and that included the poor end user experience because of the time that end users had to spend on each and every authentication with their prior solution. And what we heard from the interviewees was Duo considerably streamlined that complex process for their end users because they no longer had to type in numbers and wait for a response. And interviewees estimated essentially that Duo saved each end user about a minute on each authentication. It may not sound like a lot of time, but for a composite organization with 10,000 end users, all those minutes of employee time add up. And they're valued in this study as a total savings of $3.2 million over 3 years. So minute here, it cuts the end user frustration, and it's just a little bit more time to do whatever else they need to do. And back to my colleague Merritt.
Thanks, Marianne. So I think we said this before, right? The idea behind any kind of defense tactic is to frustrate the attacker, not the user. And so that's the idea behind, multi-factor solutions from like Cisco Duo, where it provides easy use quickly, but it also is an extra layer of defense that for someone trying to infiltrate your organization, it's going to be harder for them to bypass, and they're more likely to probably give up and go somewhere else. So that's the idea really behind this, in making it harder for the attacker to gain access, but while still delivering easy use for the end user. Next slide. I think that, the benefits, as we saw in the TEI, but I think should be pretty clear here, right? There's obviously significant risk reduction that comes through eliminating password-based access. You reduce your risk of breach, you just reduce overall IT risk organization. There are also, as Marianne just pointed out, there are significant cost efficiencies that are related because we know that passwords continue to be one of the major reasons for calls to the help desk. And the more you can reduce that, you save on operationally on the help desk side, but you also improve user productivity because they don't have to be calling the help desk every time they have an access error issue. So that's a real benefit there as well. And I think those are really the kind of three primary benefits when you look at deploying an MFA solution that can be realized. I think all of which are captured in TEI, and all of which are significant and help justify the rationale for deploying a system like Cisco Duo. And it's important to think, as an organization, that you are on a journey, so to speak, and that you may be fairly password centric today. Maybe you're using a single sign-on portal. Maybe you have some basic, whether it's SMS-based two-factor authentication, something like that, and you may even be using a password manager to help manage some of that. But where you really want to get to is kind of to that stage 2 or 3, where again you're reducing your reliance on passwords. You're using multi-factor authentication in as many places as possible. You may be supplementing with biometrics or say smart cards, and then the kind of longer term goal is that stage 3 where it's kind of full passwordless and there are no passwords used in your environment, and it's entirely protected by strong forms of authentication. So important to understand you're not necessarily going to get to stage 3 overnight, but you should have that kind of goal of trying to get to that point. And I think, as you saw from the TEI here, that there's a strong business case to kind of help you move in that journey to get to a stronger form of authentication and helping build overall value without your organization. Next slide is back to now we're back to Tracy, who will moderate the Q&A.
Awesome. Thank you, guys. And I will say to everybody else, we're going to take about 5 minutes here for Q&A. So you can definitely use the chat function while we give some folks a little bit of time to ask any questions. I'm a little curious how anyone on this call could possibly apply this TEI analysis to their organization, if you guys have any insight for them on that.
That one's probably headed my direction, Tracy. Thank you. And honestly, consider the TEI and do take a look at it as kind of a recipe. So what you'll see as you go through that TEI study is essentially a framework that you can use. And put in your own organization's numbers, your own organization's assumptions and estimates, kind of replacing what you see there. And it'll give you a pretty good sense of what your own return could be by investing in Duo. So do look at the whole study and then just take it as a framework to think through your own possible investment in Duo. Does that help, Tracy?
It does. Yes. Thank you, Marianne. And I did have a question sent to me. How much do you risk adjust the benefits and cost in a TEI study?
Good question. Because it does vary essentially based on two sets of factors. The first one is just for that particular kind of benefit, that kind of cost, how much just inherent variability is there? How many different things could make it change? And when you read the study, you'll see a little section for each benefit, each cost, called risks, and it will lay out some of those factors for you. The second thing that affects the risk adjustment is simply in these interviews, how much variability did we hear when the interviewees responded to our questions? So we essentially combine all of that and then take what we heard and either, as I mentioned, dial it up in the case of a cost, dial it down in the case of a benefit. And the percentage by which we do so is generally around 10 to 15%. Sometimes lower if something was really not too many things affected and the answers we heard were pretty darn similar. Or it could be as high as 20%, occasionally even more, if there was simply loads of variability around that particular factor. So essentially helping you sort of fine tune how much is this likely to vary for ourselves. So that's our approach to risk.
Awesome. Thank you so much. All right. Well, I did get a few other inquiries to myself, just kind of asking about recordings. So just as a reminder to everyone, I'll give this little spiel and give everyone else another minute or two to pop any questions in if they've got them. But yes, all of you will be receiving a link that will have the recording available. It will also have the slide visuals if you kind of want to go back and look at any of the slides. But yeah, if we don't have any further questions, we can end up the session just a few minutes early. But did want to extend a special thank you out to our Forrester guests, Mary Ann and Merritt. Thank you guys both very much for hopping on. And Matt, thank you. Great information, great data points. And I did want to shamelessly plug, we've got another webinar with our Forrester guest occurring on June 22nd. You guys will be receiving email invites for those as well, starting, I believe, the second week of June. So be on the lookout for those and register if you want kind of a part 2 to this. But yeah, thank you guys so much for presenting. Thank you to the audience for joining us today, and hope everyone has a great rest of your week. Happy Almost Friday.